Hey, what's up everybody? This is Brick501 and today I want to go over all of the crafting systems for Diablo 4. And there's actually been a lot of talk of the crafting systems in Diablo 4 recently. A big reason is because Wowhead did an overview of all the different systems. That's also what we're going to be using in this video. So if you want to see all the specific small little details, you can go to Wowhead and check out their overview of all the different crafting systems. But a lot of the complaints right now are that the crafting systems are too simple, and at the end of this video, I do want to go over why I think that is, because I also think that Diablo 4 developers are specifically doing this with the crafting systems and other systems in Diablo 4 for a specific reason. And there's going to be a handful of different crafters in Diablo 4 that you can find in pretty much any major city or settlement. And this starts off with the Alchemist. Now, the Alchemist is kind of new for the Diablo franchise because at the Alchemist, you'll be able to upgrade your health potion, craft elixirs, craft incense, and refine your resources. Because in Diablo 4, there's going to be a bit of a bigger focus on resources. There's even gathering out in the open world. There'll be resource specific drops from different creatures you have to go find, such as leather, and even world bosses have some specific resources they can also drop. So first off, you have upgrading your health potion. An amount of health potions you can hold. When you use health potions in combat, enemies will start to very quickly drop another one to refill the maximum amount of health potions you can carry, and then you go to the Alchemist to upgrade your health potions. And these upgrades are going to require you be a certain level, and it's just going to upgrade the health potion in a kind of linear way, and it's going to take ever increasing amounts of resources all the way to taking most of the resources in the game to upgrade the final time. So for instance, the first potion upgrade is the weak healing vial, and this requires level 1. This is completely free. It heals you for 18 life instantly and heals for 35% of your life over 3 seconds. So that's the basic level 1 potion, and all the potions are basically going to do the exact same thing in a baseline. They're going to heal you some instantly and then heal a percentage over time. And the percentage over time stays the exact same, 35% over 3 seconds, but the initial instant heal is what is going to be upgraded. So say we go to the level 10 upgrade that turns into a tiny healing vial. This heals you for 48 and then the additional 35 over 3 seconds. And this takes 8 Gallow Vine and 250 gold. And then you have a ton more upgrades all the way up to level 90, which is the superior healing vial. And these are going to cost ever increasing amounts of resources, additional other resources, and more gold. Now that's not all the Alchemist has, because you can also brew elixirs, and these are going to give you temporary buffs to different stats, and they're all also going to give you a small experience boost. And as you level up, you'll have access to higher and more potent elixirs. So for instance, the first elixir is the weak iron barb elixir. It's a magic elixir, requires level 5, takes 5 Gallow Vine, 5 bite berry, and 1,000 gold. And this increases your armor by 100, thorns by 50, and you gain 3% increased experience, and this lasts for 30 minutes. So these are essentially like potions or flasks from MMOs, and I know some people don't like this type of system, but I'm a fan of MMOs, so I generally do like this type of system. These elixirs aren't enough to where you would absolutely need it, but it's enough to where you may want to get the resources to have these potions on you when you're going to be doing harder content. And there are also elixirs to increase your resistance for pretty much every element in the game as well. Then another example would be a weak assault elixir, increase your attack speed by 7%. Every single one of the elixirs is going to give you that 3% increased experience for 30 minutes. Now there is also crafting incense, and I did go over this because this was leaked at some point, but essentially incenses are buffs that affect you and your group. And if I'm not mistaken, when you use these incense, it's not like an aura on you. It's like everybody in your party gets that same buff. And I'm still not actually sure if everybody in your party could craft and use a different incense, and then everybody in your party would have like 4 different buffs up on them at the same time. I'm not sure about that, but these are going to give you similar buffs to what elixirs are giving you. They're just given to your entire group, and I think there are some other options that elixirs don't cover, but these are essentially group buffs that you can give your entire group, and I do think these give XP as well, but that could completely change, and this was only from leaked footage, so we don't actually know a lot past that. And the final thing for the Alchemist is just refining resources. So you're turning one resource into to a different resource, and this usually costs gold and then costs a certain amount of resource to make, say, a higher tier resource. So for instance, you have silver ore, and this would cost 10 iron chunks to make a silver ore, and it costs 200 gold. So you're essentially just taking resources you find in the world, raw resources, crafting them into a more refined resource that's going to be used in other crafting methods. And next up, we have the Blacksmith, and the Blacksmith is going to allow you to craft armor and weapons, upgrade your armor and weapons, salvage items, and repair your gear. So somewhat similar to in Diablo 3, and the basic ones are just repairing your gear. Your gear will lose durability on death and just in combat. You can go to the Blacksmith to just repair it for some gold. Then you have salvaging items, and it's going to have basically the same UI as in Diablo 3, which I think works pretty well, or at least the one that was put into Diablo 3 later down the road. So you can salvage all of one specific rarity of items, and you get to choose which rarity, or you can just specifically choose all the items you want to salvage, and you're going to salvage them for different resources. Pretty basic. Then you also have crafting armor and weapons, and we know this is in the game, but we don't really know a ton about this. I would expect this is probably going to work in a similar way to Diablo 3, but it's probably going to be a little bit more complex or a little bit more open because you have so much more different resources in Diablo 4, and there's a more of a focus on these resources. So most likely you're going to be able to craft more armors and weapons and probably have more control over how they come out than you did in Diablo 3. Now, the place where the Blacksmith is really important is upgrading gear. Now, every piece of your gear can be upgraded a certain amount of times depending on what rarity that gear is, and that gear will be upgraded by 5 item level every time you upgrade it. It costs gold and just different materials, and it's going to cost more materials and gold every time you upgrade it. And upgrading an item pretty much upgrades everything. It's going to increase its affixes, and it's going to increase its base armor or base weapon damage depending on if it's an armor piece or a weapon. So it's going to upgrade majority of the things on that gear piece. And again, the higher rarity the item, the more you can actually upgrade it, but I'm not 100% sure on how many times you can actually upgrade different pieces, and I'm assuming that's something that will probably change or has been changed, because that's a pretty big balancing point that they could change up quite a lot. But the higher you get these upgrades, it's going to cost a lot more resources, but this is also going to be very important for your overall power as a character. These are going to get quite expensive, and you can upgrade every single piece, so this means you're probably going to have to be pretty picky on what you're upgrading at the start of the game, and until you get multiple max level characters and have a ton of resources, you're probably not just going to be upgrading any piece of gear. And next up, we have the jeweler, which is kind of like the blacksmith for jewelry. So the jeweler is going to be able to craft jewelry and gems, add sockets to gear, unsocket gems, and upgrade jewelry in exchange for crafting materials and gold, basically the same way the blacksmith can upgrade your armor and weapons. So jewelry is considered to be a different thing than armor or weapons. So if you want to upgrade those pieces, you have to come to the jeweler. And I think that the jewelry is going to take different resources for upgrading, and it's probably going to be quite a bit more expensive and might work a little bit differently than the upgrades from the blacksmith, but it's still going to be in that same vein. Now, some of the more basic stuff, you're going to be able to craft jewelry, probably going to work in a similar way to the blacksmith for crafting armor and weapons. We don't really know a bunch of specifics about it, but pretty much everything I mentioned about crafting at the blacksmith is probably going to apply to the jeweler. Then you're able to unsocket gems, so any gems you put into a gear piece, you're able to take those out for gold at the jeweler. Then you're able to add sockets to item using something called a scattered prism, and scattered prisms only come from the world bosses in the game, so those are going to be something you're wanting to do as much as you possibly can, because adding sockets to items is going to be incredibly strong. And I don't actually know how many sockets can be on a singular item. Now, I know I've heard you can only have 2 on an item, but I've also seen some older leaked footage that it seemed people had 3 sockets on some pieces. Not exactly sure on how that's going to work, and I do think armor and weapons are going to have a different socket amount from jewelry, if I'm not mistaken. But again, that's an area that we don't really need to specifically go over, because that's a spot that they could very easily change for tuning or balancing purposes. Now, upgrading your jewelry is going to work in a very similar way to the blacksmith, but on jewelry, it's going to increase the resistances of that jewelry piece and increase the stats rolled on that item, so in a very similar way to the Blacksmith, and jewelry pieces can be upgraded different amounts of times depending on the rarity. And it's going to cost different resources than upgrading at the Blacksmith, and it's going to cost more and more resources as you keep upgrading a singular item. So for instance, for jewelry, a legendary can be upgraded 4 times and a rare item can be upgraded 3 times. And it's going to get very expensive when you get to the highest upgrades because it's going to start to cost ridiculous amounts of gold and even like legendary resources. And then you can also craft gems. Now, crafting gems is going to work in basically the same way it worked in Diablo 3. You get a certain amount of one tier of gem, and then you'll upgrade that gem into the next tier of that gem, and then you need a certain amount of that tiered gem to upgrade it to the next tier. That's pretty much exactly how it's going to work in Diablo 4, and the gem statting is going to work in kind of the same way as well. Every single different color of gem is going to have different stats for all of the different pieces of gearing in the game. So for instance, you have an amethyst. You have a crude amethyst, which is basically the lowest tier. So for weapons, you get 4% increased damage over time. For armor, you get 6.6% damage over time reduction. And for jewelry, you get 11.5% shadow resistance. And that will obviously go up every time you upgrade a specific amethyst. But then for something like a diamond, you get 4% ultimate damage increase on weapons. Then for armor, you get 4% barrier potency. And for jewelry, you get 4% resistance to all elements. So as you would expect, that's going to be stronger every time you upgrade the gem to a higher tier. And then you're just going to be picking and choosing between all the different gems, depending on what type of gear you're putting it into, and depending on what's going to work best for your build. And some of these gems are pretty strong. But also one thing to note, from what I've seen, there is not a gem that increases your experience like there was in Diablo 3. So everything's going to be completely focused on making you stronger in combat. And finally, we have the Occultist. It actually has a lot of additional crafting. So at the Occultist, you can extract and imprint aspects, which are legendary powers. You can craft and salvage nightmare sigils, which are the endgame dungeon key system. And then you can also enchant items, or what's essentially going to be re-rolling affixes on gear pieces. So first off, we have the enchanting system. Now this is going to work in kind of the same way as Diablo 3. You're able to take one affix on a piece of gear, select that affix, and then you'll be able to infinitely roll only that one affix on that piece of gear and turn it into different affixes. Now there are going to be some limits because some pieces of gear or some affixes won't be able to roll into any other affix into the game, but you are going to have a pretty big selection of affixes you can roll into, and this is obviously going to randomly roll that affix. So you could be looking for a different affix and also looking for the best rolled version of that affix. And you're only going to be able to do this on rare or legendary items, and the gold cost of re-rolling this affix is going to increase with every single roll. So you're technically not able to infinitely roll this, but you will have a ton of rolls, and probably very late into the end game, you'll have enough resources to roll these quite a lot. So you can change one affix on all of your gear pieces. And then we have the crafting nightmare sigil system. Now, if you haven't heard about this system, in Diablo 4, a big focus of the game is going to be dungeons. There's going to be over 150 dungeons on the launch of the game. There are going to be unique areas that have specific enemies in them and have specific objectives in them, but the dungeons are going to be able to kind of randomize paths and where enemies spawn and stuff like that. But once you get into the end game, you can get nightmare sigils, which are essentially a dungeon key to turn that dungeon into a nightmare dungeon, making it much more difficult and putting different modifiers on the dungeon that make it harder in some way, but will also give you more loot. And all nightmare sigils are to a specific dungeon and they have their own tiers. So for instance, common nightmare sigils would have different crafts for tier 1 to tier 5, and that's the same craft. And then tier 6 to 10 would be a different craft, and those are the common nightmare sigils. Then you go up to sacred and ancestral nightmare sigils, and essentially these are just different tiers. These are going to be harder as you go up. They're going to add more afflictions into that dungeon, which are basically just negatives to make the dungeon harder. And then they're obviously going to be giving you more and more loot, and it's going to take increasing amounts of different resources and gold to craft the higher and higher tiers of nightmare sigils. Now, we don't know what other ways you can go about getting nightmare sigils, because we have heard that you're able to get them from other endgame systems, but we know you're able to craft them at the Occultist. And then you're also able to salvage nightmare sigils. So if you get one you don't like, or if you get one that's just horrible for your build, you could salvage it, get some of the resources back, and try to go craft a different one that's better for your build. build. Now, one of the biggest pieces of the Occultist is extracting and imprinting legendary aspects or legendary powers, because there's multiple systems that tie into this. So at a baseline, every legendary piece of gear you get is going to have a legendary power on it, and if you want to, you can extract that legendary power out of that gear. It'll give you a new item with that legendary power on that piece of gear, and then you can go take that power and imprint it on either a different rare or a different legendary item. If you imprint it on a rare item, it'll turn the rare into a legendary item, and if you imprint it on a legendary, it removes that legendary's original power and adds the one you're adding to it. And this is going to be a pretty big part of the end game, because legendary powers also can roll in a range. So say one legendary power maybe 10 to 30% on whatever that effect is. So you're still going to be wanting to grind these legendary powers to get the best rolls. Then we also have the Codex of Power that plays into this system as well, and the Codex of Power is tied into the legendary system as well, because this is a codex of legendary aspects or legendary powers that you can unlock by completing dungeons. And these are permanent unlocks, so if you go complete a dungeon, it'll unlock a specific legendary aspect in the codex. Now these are permanent across your account, so once you unlock one of these powers, you could put it on infinite items just for a gold cost. So if you had 20 rare items and you had a legendary codex power, you could put it on all 20 items just for gold. But the powers in the codex are going to be the lowest rolled versions of legendary powers. So like I mentioned, if it's 10 to 30%, the codex would always be 10%. And this is going to tie into imprinting. You would imprint the power from the codex in the exact same way you would imprint those extracted legendary powers, and you can put them on rare or legendary items. And the codex is going to be a really good way for creating new character builds. So you're going to have a lot of the legendary powers you want right off the bat. They're just going to be weaker, and it's also going to be very good for just new characters. Once you have a bunch of legendary aspects unlocked in the codex, you make a new character, you can have a bunch of legendary powers pretty much right off the bat, or at least once you start to get rare item drops. Now there is another slight downside to the codex. It doesn't house all the legendary powers in the game, so there are still some that are probably going to be more rare. You still have to go out and hunt to actually get that legendary power, but they are going to house over 100 legendary aspects, so a good chunk of the legendary powers from the game will be in the codex. Now that's all the different crafting options you're going to have in Diablo 4 on the launch of the game. And like I mentioned, there have been a lot of talk around this system because a lot of people think it's way too simplified and it doesn't have as many options as a lot of the other ARPGs that are currently popular. And I did want to go over this because I think there's kind of a big misconception for Diablo 4 on the launch of the game. I think they are specifically trying to make a lot of the game complex enough to have a lot of options, but also still pretty simple. And I think this is something that developers are consciously doing with the game, because my theory on this is that since the game is so focused on being a live service game with new seasons and expansions, that they want a good solid foundation that's easy to build upon. So they don't want dozens of different crafting systems or dozens of different super complex systems that are going to be really hard to build upon. So you build one thing on it and then 300 other things change and it's impossible to balance. I think they want this good foundation on launch, and then keep in mind we're getting a new gameplay systems, so they're already going to start increasing the complexity of the game a few weeks after the launch. And I think this is one of the big reasons why the crafting in Diablo 4 may seem a bit too simplified compared to a lot of the other games that have been going for years and years, such as Path of Exile. And I think it's because they want it that way at the start. Now personally, I do hope they start adding more crafting into the game with future seasons. Like every new season we could get some other type of crafting that allows us to augment or craft different pieces of gear to keep increasing that complexity. And I think that's something that they're probably going to end up doing. So even though these crafting systems are pretty simplistic, I think this gives you enough options to create quite a lot of builds and have a lot of options, but also creates a good stable foundation so they can much more easily build upon it and make it more complex with every new build. So leave a like if you liked the video. If you comment down below what you guys think about all the crafting systems in Diablo 4, and thanks for watching.